fourth lesson in your ecology unit of work will have been on feeding relationships. Now, if we're going to summarise the key knowledge on feeding relationships, they simply show what eats what within an ecosystem. So they show the links between different organisms that are either predators or prey of other organisms. That is all they show. Feeding relationships are broken down into two different types: food chains and food webs. Food chains show a simple feeding relationship between different organisms at what we call different trophic levels. So these organisms can be broken down into these different levels. The first of which we call producers, which are pretty much plants, and the reason why they're called producers is because they make their own food by photosynthesis. Producers are always eaten by primary consumers. So these are organisms that primarily eat plants, otherwise you call them herbivores. Now, they eat plants, they eat these producers to gain energy. So whenever you see a food chain, such as the one drawn on the slide, you see an arrow drawn from the producer to the consumer, because that is the direction of energy transfer between the two organisms. Now, within that feeding relationship, you then have a secondary consumer, and these are carnivores. These eat the primary consumers. They can eat more than one different type of primary consumer, and if they do so, that means they are contained within a food web, as is shown on the bigger diagram on the slide, which are a selection of interlinked food chains. So, for example, if you look at the food web, you see the leopard. The leopard eats baboons. They also eat impala, and they have arrows drawn from the baboon and the impala to the leopard, because that is where the leopard gets its energy from. And food chains and food webs can go up several levels. So they start with producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are then eaten by tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers are then eaten by quaternary consumers. And they go on and on, depending on the size of the food web or food chain, but you only need to think about producers, primary and secondary consumers. Now, you have to bear in mind that during each of these stages, energy can also be lost. So the plant, the producer, starts with a certain amount of energy. Primary consumer takes it in through eating it, but then the primary consumer respires it, excretes it, reproduces, which requires energy. So therefore, some of that energy is transferred to different parts of the environment, so the secondary consumer doesn't get as much, and that continues all the way up a food chain or a food web. So those are your main definitions there, really, and it's just bearing in mind that a feeding relationship is about what eats what within an ecosystem.